Over on my community tab on YouTube, I asked you, Zelda crew, what enemies you would like to see return in the sequel to Breath of the Wild, and in this video, I'm going to be reacting to your replies. PJC92 says, Redeads, please. It's been 2 decades since those guys have been in a 3D Zelda properly. There were, quote, Redead Knights in Twilight Princess, but they're not the same as the things of terror, horror, and fear from Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and Wind Waker. Those guys really need to return to 3D Zelda badly. It's been 2 decades since actual real Redeads have appeared in a 3D Zelda. Come on, Nintendo. PJC92, thank you for your response. And I have to say, I agree with you, man. I remember the first time I came across the Redeads in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. What a truly bone-chilling experience it was, man. With their highly pitched screams, how the screen literally freezes while the Redead slowly approaches Link. Not to mention what happens when the Redead manages to get Link. It's absolutely terrifying, especially for somebody a little bit on the younger side of things when he first played Ocarina of Time. Now, I do agree that the Redead Knights in Twilight Princess were nothing compared to the Redeads throughout the series, so good call there, dude. I also think that seeing these Zelda enemies in Breath of the Wild 2's game engine would totally fit the whole aesthetic that Nintendo mentioned that they were going for in the sequel. I mean, if you're wanting to make this game darker than Majora's Mask, this might be the way to do it. The Elite Casual Gamer says, I want to see enemies that give more personality to the areas. Peahat and Wolfos in the forest areas, for example, Levers in the desert, Redead and Gyptos in spooky places, and of course, Darknuts would just be awesome. I agree. Giving more personality to the areas in the sequel to Breath of the Wild is such an amazing idea, and I never really thought of that. The Elite Casual Gamer gives an example of adding Peahats to the forest areas in the sequel, as well as Wolfos, which again, I think is a brilliant idea. It would give so much more depth to the game, as well as give us, Zelda crew, a very good reason to explore every inch of Breath of the Wild 2's map. Wolfos, personally, I'd be more interested in seeing than the Peahats just because I like the fact that the Wolfos are a slightly harder enemy to defeat as far as their pattern recognition goes. Unless you catch the Wolfos with their back turned, then they're pretty easy. Thanks for the support on the channel, my man. Jake L says, I totally agree about wanting Darknuts and Iron Knuckles. Thanks, dude. I'd like to see flying enemies as well, like Kargaroks and Peahats, which should work well since the game has us returning to the sky. Overall, just having a larger variety of enemies in the game would be really great. I mentioned in this post as well what I would like to see return as far as enemies in Breath of the Wild 2, and I picked either the Darknuts or the Iron Knuckles, and a lot of you on this channel agreed with me, much like Jake here. He also mentioned that he'd like to see flying enemies like Kargaroks and Peahats, another favorite, it seems, to make a return in the sequel. Jay goes on to make a very valid point here that makes sense because the sky in the sequel to Breath of the Wild seems to be a very important part of the game. And I think flying enemies would make a lot of sense here, right? I think he's 100% accurate there. I think adding flying enemies in the sequel would definitely make any sky travel that we may or may not do, Zelda crew, somewhat difficult depending on what enemies actually make it into the final game. I appreciate your support, Jake. Stuart the Zelda-holic. I love the name, bro. He says, oh, D-Rock, here we go. Helmasaurs, Tektites. I want a tribe of river Zoras that shoot fireballs. A Zora Civil War side story would be cool. Gotta have Darknuts. And here's a classic. Daria? I think I'm saying that right. Those jerks in Zelda 2's Death Mountain with the hatchets. I was just looking up what these things were called, and there are these Birdman enemies in Zelda 2 called Fukuru, I think. I want those back just so I can yell Fuku Fukuru at the television. Oh man, Stuart, you're amazing. See you, D-Rock. Stuart, it's always a pleasure when you drop comments on my channel. I really thank you for the continued support. Stuart goes on a rampage here by saying that he'd like to see Helmasaurs return, as well as Tektites, River Zora that shoot fireballs, the Darknuts, and I mean, of course, right, as well as the Daria from Zelda 2. Now, other than dropping a like down below this video, and from the list of enemies Stuart mentioned, I would like to focus on the River Zoras because, well, 1, they're freaking cool, and 2, you already know that I would love to see the Darknuts return. So, the River Zora would be such a cool thing to see in the sequel while we are traveling from location exploration and location, I think. It would be a really great way to give us, Zelda crew, another reason to have underwater exploration in the sequel. I think having to not only reflect their fireballs back at the Fire Zora would definitely be a nostalgia hit for sure, but I could definitely see Nintendo maybe changing the way to defeat these things by maybe having to fight them underwater, and while we're underwater, finding a way to exploit their weakness, like an eye or something, you know, something that's never been done before in the Zelda series. Rowdy Robbie says, hands down the most nightmarish monster ever, the Dead Hand. I don't know if there's ever been a scarier monster in Zelda. The Dead Hand. I couldn't agree more, man. I don't think there is and has ever been an enemy in the Legend of Zelda series that was quite literally this scary. I remember in Ocarina of Time when the thing shot up from the ground in the Shadow Temple, I was like, Man, I think the Dead Hand would look absolutely insane in Breath of the Wild 2's graphic engine, and I think it would fit perfectly because it does sound like, based on what we have seen in the trailers, that we will be able to explore darker places like the underground or caves, for example. And Nintendo did say that this would be a darker Zelda game. I honestly couldn't think of a better enemy to put in the sequel if a darker Zelda game is the end goal. The thing is, even with all of these amazing enemies that we all want to see return in the sequel to Breath of the Wild, it's really all just theories and speculation, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that in the slightest. It's always fun to put our thoughts out there on this amazing franchise and see if anyone else in the community feels the same. And if you click on this video here, I talk about why I think that Breath of the Wild 2 will be the darkest Zelda game you will ever play in the Legend of Zelda series. You're not going to want to miss this one. Zelda crew, much peace and love. Be the light, and remember, it's dangerous to go alone. Click this.